Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest, Deborah Collier, and I want to get this right here, the Vice President for Policy and Government Affairs and Executive Director of the Citizens Against Government Waste's Innovation and Technology Policy Center. Did I get that right?
You did get that right.
Let's start with some easy questions and go from there. What led you to your current position at Citizens Against Government Waste? What was your career path to get here?
Going back to my career path, I first came to Washington in the 1980s, mid-1980s, working for Clarence Miller from Ohio, who was one of the Defense Appropriations members. And I came for a 2-month internship that evolved into a permanent position with him doing consumer or constituent casework for the congressman. Which, involved handling a lot of personal information about his constituents. We always tried to make sure that information was kept protected and made sure that they knew their rights with the information that they were giving us. There was the Privacy Act of 1972 that actually governed the work that we did. So, we tried to maintain their confidentiality when we were working on their cases for the congressman. And then eventually I went to work for a member from Indiana who I was, interestingly enough, his information technology director, and did everything from opening up the backs of the computers and changing out motherboards to advising him on technology issues that were before him that he was working on. Eventually he became chairman of the VA committee, and I went there and worked as the Republican legislative director for the committee during his tenure as chairman and then ranking member. And then I left the Hill in 2011, came here to CAGW as the very first technology policy director for CAGW. And part of that portfolio, interestingly enough, was the privacy portfolio.
Why has Citizens Against Government Waste maintained such an active role in the issue of privacy, both government and commercial? That's not a natural thing you think of when you think of Citizens Against Government Waste.
I know. Normally people think of us rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. But there's a fourth wheel to our mission, and that's mismanagement. So, when you consider the government is probably the largest holder of consumer information or personal identifying information in the country, perhaps in the world even, making sure that information is protected and secure and kept, protected and preserved, and knowing that your data is safe with the government is critically important. When I worked at the VA committee, I worked at the time that there was the largest data breach in the history of the VA, where a laptop was stolen from an employee's car that contained the information on 25 million veterans. That was a huge impact, and something that the VA committee worked on stringently to figure out. How do we navigate this type of situation where there's a breach of data about our constituents across the country? And when you consider veterans, these are people who fought for our country, who served our nation, and to have their information stolen like that was pretty devastating for many of the members of the committee who, the veterans are the mission. Taking care of them and to have their information stolen like that, that's not taking care of the veterans. The laptop was eventually recovered, and still It was very costly to the government to do the remediation on, through data breach notifications and through, having their mitigation taken care of.
The flip side to the government mismanagement of data is the issue of commercial, or some people refer to it as consumer privacy. How do you think that the private sector is doing in managing and handling the data that they have today?
I think that they're really trying to make sure that the data that they hold is kept secure, but that doesn't always happen when you've got people constantly hitting our computing systems and trying to hack into our computers and get data to sell on the dark web. So, I do believe that companies are trying to maintain secure systems, but it's really a challenge.
Is there a financial interest for them, for private companies, to maintain proper structure? Is it good for their bottom line and afraid of the next story?
It is very good for them to be very protective of consumer information, because it does impact their bottom line in that they have to, when there is a data breach, they have to do the remediation, they have to do the notification, and it's really bad publicity when you see a major company having a data breach. It hurts their brand greatly when they have a data breach.
I guess I'd be interested to know, are there legitimate uses from data flows between companies that could make the user experience better? Whether it be online and you're buying something, or whether it be something you're trying to research, or whatever the case may be?
Sure. There's a lot of different uses for sharing data. For example, when you look at the healthcare industry, you go to your doctor sends the prescription to your pharmacy. Your pharmacy's got data about you, say it's got a list of your allergies. It may look at this medication that your doctor has prescribed you, and yet your doctor's got the list of allergies too, but it creates that double checking system. And there's been occasions where I've gone to fill out a prescription, and the pharmacist said, "Oh, you can't take this. It has this in it, and you're allergic to this." And I probably get that a lot because I'm allergic to World. But, it's one of those double checking systems that if the data and the information's not shared, then nobody has the complete story about your health care. And you could get prescribed something that would have a really adverse effect on you. The same thing goes with, you go for an x-ray and you say, I need this x-ray done because my doctor's ordered it. They're sharing data between the x-ray, the radiology department, and the doctor's office. Without keeping that secure, that information could be released out to others that, I don't know what somebody would use and somebody else's x-ray for. But you need to keep that stuff secure. Financial institutions, they share data. As far as like you get a car loan, they have to make sure that they're giving that loan to somebody who has the correct credit. So you've got that double check. And there's some laws already in place. There's HIPAA and there's the financial information privacy that protect, but then you get into consumer shopping. Say you're looking for a product and you go online and you're like, type in, say, cowboy boots. I am a cowboy boot shopper.
Wouldn't have guessed that.
I love my cowboy boots. I have several. And so say I'm wanting to get a new pair of cowboy boots. So I type in cowboy boots in my size online, and it serves me up a lot of information. Well, I haven't yet hit the trigger to buy one yet. So it continues to feed me that information. And Sometimes it overserves the advertising to the point where maybe it'll be 3 months before the advertising for my cowboy boots stops. But, you know, it does me a service in that it gives me a variety of choice. That if the algorithms weren't working that way on the search engine, I may only go to one store and may pay more than I really should for a product, where the algorithm will give me a choice of where, you know, I can shop and get the best price. So you know, having that data that on my online searches shared out, that's enabling me as a consumer to get the best price.
So, what is the value in advocating for a new privacy structure or statute, I should say? You know, you mentioned data protected on healthcare, on financial transactions, and financial information. The United States has been called a patchwork of privacy laws. What's the value in having a new structure on privacy across the board?
Well, the patchwork is a really apt description, because right now we have at least 24 states that have their own individual and sometimes multiple different versions of what consumer data privacy looks like, whether it's through biometrics or child protection, privacy. There's a number of different laws in place in the states, and oftentimes those laws compete against one another. So if you're a small business or even a medium-sized business doing interstate commerce, and this really is interstate commerce, not intrastate. When you're a business that's wanting to engage in interstate commerce, you have to navigate all these different laws, sometimes counterintuitively balancing how you're going to protect consumer data. And if there happens to be a breach of that data, it's confusing as to which state's laws would prevail over that data breach. Is it the state that you live in? Is it the state that the company is located in? And that's creating confusion for consumers across the country when their information is not protected as it should be. It also creates this horribly impossible puzzle to navigate for businesses. When you're a small business, you don't have the fees to pay legal team. You don't have a legal team on staff. You have to go and get an attorney to represent you, and hopefully they're familiar with interstate laws between the states, you know, whether it's California or Oklahoma or New Hampshire or Vermont. You need somebody who knows all the different laws in all the different states to navigate consumer data privacy. And a lot of these small and middle-sized businesses don't have the financial resources to have somebody on their team to do this kind of work.
It's been described that you could a company could always comply with the most restrictive situation. You regulate up kind of situation. You could always comply
Right.
with. But are there not situations? Does it not exist where the number of statutes in the states are conflicting with each other?
Yes.
So you may be in compliance with one state that made you do something, and another state might find that a violation. How are companies reacting to that, or do they just have to figure out what markets they're going to approach?
It's more that they have to figure out what markets they're going to approach. If I was a small business starting out, I would want to do interstate commerce, and I would do my due diligence to make sure that the information I'm getting from my customers is protected. But if I'm concerned about having to comply with all these different state laws, and there's about 24 now that are major state privacy bills in those,
Half the nation.
half the nation. And some of them counter each other, as you said. I'm probably going to limit what states I do business with. And that limits my company's growth. So I can't even grow because
you can't even really market.
You can't.
Nationwide, you're
right. You're restricted on what you can do. So, if the government wants to help these businesses grow, and I keep hearing about how we want to make things more affordable, we want to enable small business to succeed, then one really easy way to do this, and it's not really that easy, but one way to do this is to enact a national comprehensive data privacy framework that covers all 50 states and the 5 territories and the District of Columbia, and have that across the board framework that is the standard for everybody to follow.
What's happening globally? We talk about the rest of the world and how they handle privacy. People like to highlight the European Union and how they have really tough privacy statutes, but then they also are known for having lax enforcement, and that they like to enforce it more towards U.S. companies. How does Europe and the rest of the world do privacy?
Not very well. That's the short answer. Right now we've got the EU starting to pull back on a lot of its privacy regulations because they're just not working. They're hindering innovation, they're hindering growth, economic growth, and we're starting to see them pulling back on some of these regulations because the member countries are like, we can't keep doing this. But you're right, there is this tendency in the EU to go after American companies. Why? Because American companies, because they're here, aren't as restricted regulatory. They don't have as many regulatory restrictions here in the U.S. as what is being imposed in Europe.
How would a European model work in the United States? We don't have lax enforcement. We have active trial bar. We have active state attorney generals. What would be the outcome if we were to adopt some of the more comprehensive and restrictive statutes that are popular elsewhere?
Well, one needs only look at California, which has the most restrictive data privacy rules in the nation. And we see a lot of folks leaving, a lot of businesses leaving California because it does have a very heavy hand when it comes to regulating literally everything you do as far as being a business entity in the state. So there would definitely be, if that were type of law were adopted nationwide, it would definitely have a diminishing effect on our economic stability.
Talk a little bit, if you can, on the current status of getting a federal framework on privacy. How is Congress approaching this issue?
Well, we thought we had something. We really did think we had something that was going to pass in the 118th Congress. Unfortunately, there were 2 items, state preemption and private right of action, that kind of tanked the bill, where the exemptions to preempt in the state laws they might as well have not had any preemption, because the number of states that were going to be exempt was so big, we were going to have the status quo. The private right of action is a whole nother animal where, it's without prohibiting a private right of action, or at least restricting it severely, it just opens the door to a lot of litigation and lawsuits. So we get into 119th Congress and we're back at square one. We have not, I know that the committees have been discussing privacy amongst themselves. And we were hoping that by now we would see draft legislation, but we haven't. The private right of action and it creates this opening for a lot of lawsuits across the country. And it's basically a gift to the trial lawyers. So those two things are the things that really inhibit the ability to get something across the line in Congress.
What's the likelihood of the rest of the year in terms of, it seems like members are starting to look about the November elections.
Mm-hmm.
Does it seem like it's possible we're going to see a new federal statute enacted, or are we, will we see new language we can look at, or what's your expectation?
I was very optimistic at the beginning of last year. I really thought that this was the year we could get it done. I really did. And now we haven't even seen draft language. So I'm not so optimistic anymore. I think it's going to be a hard lift at this point to get anything done as far as consumer data privacy, unless it's coupled with something relating to artificial intelligence.
So that brings me to the next interesting kind of category. What would jumpstart that process? Is it some other type of issue? Where's the administration on these things?
Well, artificial intelligence was mentioned during the State of the Union. It is a top priority for the president. Clearly, from everything that he's done with his executive orders, he is trying to promote the use of artificial intelligence both in government and, for the private sector. He's trying to encourage this innovative new technology and allow that to grow, because if we become a global leader in artificial intelligence, then that sets the stage for further leadership in new technologies. As I said, the only way I can see consumer data privacy being enacted is if it was coupled with regulations on artificial intelligence.
Is there an interplay between the two?
Yes, there is, absolutely. Because when you think about how does artificial intelligence work, it learns from data. It learns from our data. It learns from, facial recognition. It learns from data analytics. It's pulling in a lot of data to provide the output that we are wanting to see. With that use of data, there needs to be parameters about how that data can be used and where that is going. And that's why it's so important, because if we can enact a national framework for data privacy, it will cover the use of data by artificial intelligence. Because artificial intelligence is just another technology. It's not this intelligent human being. It's another technology, just like we talk about the algorithms that are used for generating and serving us advertising. The same algorithms and data is being used to feed into what artificial intelligence provides.
And has the administration weighed in on a federal privacy statute, or have they kind of understandably busy by some other things? And also, it seems like some people feel a little burned off of last Congress's effort on privacy.
Yeah, I do think people feel a little bit burned by that effort. And I haven't really seen any statement issued by the president on how he believes consumer data privacy should be protected. He is saying a lot about artificial intelligence, and I think that needs to be part of that conversation.
When you talk about a federal privacy statute or comprehensive framework, there has to be some federal agency involved, someone has to implement it.
Mm-hmm.
Who would that be in your mind, and can we trust those agencies anymore to do the right thing?
If you had asked me that same question 8 years ago, I would have said the Federal Trade Commission. But, the 4 years of the Biden administration just showed how not independent agencies can be. with the chair during the Biden administration, creating her own rules of the road and going after companies for anything that she personally felt was part of antitrust, whether she was right or wrong, and literally going after every single large company she could think of, from grocery stores to technology companies to airlines. She was after everybody, and almost overextending her authority, including doing an advance notice of rulemaking on consumer data privacy without congressional authority. It's hard to do rulemaking when Congress hasn't given you the authority to do the rulemaking. As the Federal Communications Commission learned the hard way.
How then that's a very awkward spot, right? If we're not comfortable with the federal agencies that may be asked to implement it, how do you solve that problem to get a statute into place?
There have been suggestions made that a new federal agency is created. Of course, it's going to cost money, which we're against waste. But that's been one of the suggestions, is to have an agency created that would only focus on consumer data privacy issues. Another option would be to put it under the Department of Justice for enforcement purposes, or a combination of Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice working alongside state attorney generals.
Let's circle back a little bit about the state statutes that have been enacted. What has made so many states move forward to write conflicting provisions? Why do they must recognize that the consumers are across borders and their consumers want to be served? Are they not aware of? They talk constantly. They have a number of conferences. They're aware of these. What gets us to this situation we have today?
Well, number one is the inaction by Congress. That is the number one issue that is pushing the states to do something. The second thing is that they see things happening in their own communities with consumers' data being breached, and they want to help. There's no shortage of people wanting to help this situation. And when they see that Congress is not doing anything, they're like, well, if Congress isn't going to act, we have to. But they're not really paying attention to what's happening in the other states, even though they're all going to the same conferences, even though they're all talking together at these conferences. They each feel like, well, this is an issue that's not being addressed at all by anybody. For example, child safety online. That's a huge issue in the states, and it should be a huge issue for Congress. And I know Congress has worked on a couple bills trying to enact at least child online safety. But then they go even further. Oh, how is our consumer data being handled? And, who's going to be responsible if there's a breach? Congress isn't dictating this, so we have to. That's really what it's coming down to. If Congress is not going to do the job, then somebody has to.
What keeps them from, all in agreement? There are a number of efforts to kind of stay in the same lane, and you've got just such a huge patchwork.
Right. At one time, the Buckeye Institute actually was trying to get together a consortium of states to agree on parameters that they would follow, but not enough states signed on to something like that. So, you've got local, state organizations saying, why are we banging our heads up against this wall of doing different things? Why can't we all just come together, come to an agreement to do consumer data privacy within these parameters? And you've got states like California who want to regulate everybody and anything, to the point where you've got businesses leaving the state because they are overregulated. And then you've got other states that aren't even bothering with consumer data privacy, but they may eventually, unless Congress does something to fix the problem.
What can the outside community do, whether it be think tanks, associations, companies themselves? What can they do to spur on the interest in Congress in addressing this issue?
The first thing they can do is they can contact their members of Congress and say, hey, this is a big issue, and it needs to be your number one priority. Let's work on getting this done and getting this done this Congress. And if enough people reach out to their members of Congress, we can go up to Capitol Hill all we want and talk to them and say, this is important. They'll be like, yeah, this is important. Yeah, we agree. But unless they hear from the people who they represent, it's really hard to get things done.
Has there been, we've worked on this issue for quite a while, has there been a reduction in interest or a gradual loss of interest from consumers or companies or both?
I don't think so. I think this is still an important issue. I think for the companies, at least the large companies, they're like looking, okay, who's got the worst case scenario and can we comply with that? And that's what they're doing. Smaller companies don't have the benefit of having the big picture and doing that. For consumers, it's a topic, every time I go back to visit my family, it's a topic of conversation at the dinner table. What's going on with privacy? Privacy is, my data just got exposed again. And, what can we do to solve this problem? And they all look to me for answers because they know I work in Washington, D.C. So, and I tell them, well, I've been working on this issue for decades, as many people in our sphere of influence have done, including yourself, and it's just, for some reason, this is a hard nut to crack.
So put on your fortune teller hat. When you look out 2 to 5 years or maybe longer, will we have a new comprehensive framework on privacy at the federal level? Is it doable? Is it possible?
I'm not sure we can get it done in 2 years. I really find it unlikely that in 2 years we'll be able to get something done, just because there is this hard line between preempting states' laws and the private right of action piece. Those two items are really the hump that need to be overcome to get anything done. 5 years down the road, will we see data privacy framework? I'm leaning towards being a little bit more optimistic about 5-year outlook, just simply because we are so focused right now on how artificial intelligence it works, how it's going to improve data flows, how it's going to allow us to have access to more and more information. With that information comes the need to protect the information. So I think as we continue having the conversation and including artificial intelligence, we are going to see more ability to get something done for having a national framework for consumer data privacy.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I can't thank you enough for sharing your expert opinion on a really complicated and important topic.
Great.
Thanks so very much.
Thank you, Mike.